Going to introduce today's speaker. I edited considerably what I had originally written. Sandy Shapiro has been an active member of this community for over 40 years. I believe Sandy was born in the Rochester area and used the libraries, and the community has been dedicated to Rochester all his adult life. But I also remember, after my very first book, Sandwiched in Introduction, receiving a magnificent email helping me understand the value and nature of the introduction. I had read verbatim a 4-page document that our speaker had forwarded me. And Sandy, who has been on the BSI committee now for many years and on the Friends board for 13 years, 3 of which, or maybe 2 as president, let me know that it wasn't necessary to read 4 pages of an intro. So what you're going to get is the abbreviated version of Sandy's bio. One of the reasons Sandy was chosen to review this book is that he has had broad experience in the trial of medical malpractice cases and in defending doctors charged with medical misconduct. And as you will find out, that is quite relevant to today's review. Sandy is currently the Senior Litigation Counsel at Forsyth, Howe, O'Dwyer, Kalb, and Murphy, PC. As I said, he's been long active in the Rochester community. In 1996, he was recognized by receiving the prestigious Nathaniel Award for his work in the community. He's also been on the Friends Board for a long, long time and a major supporter of the Rochester Public Library. He has also reviewed several books for us. His last was Counsel, A Life at the Edge of History, Ted Sorensen's account of his 11 years as President Kennedy's speechwriter and confidant. And on a personal note, and I don't do this very often, I told the former director several years ago that my involvement as a volunteer with the Friends was made worthwhile because I was able to meet Sandy and Miriam Shapiro. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sandy.
The destiny of the Republic, madness, medicine, and the murder of President James A. Garfield. A book I think that you would all be interested in. Now, my review is going to be a little different because I'm going to start out with a quiz. How many American presidents have there been unsuccessful attempts at assassination on? Anybody know? Well, I'll tell you the answer. You know? Oh no. Unsuccessful attempts that we know about. If you count the guy that took rifle shots at the White House about 4 or 5 months ago, when the president and his family weren't in the White House, 19 unsuccessful attempts. All right. Now, how many successful assassinations have there been of American presidents? 4, if you count James A. Garfield. And as you're going to hear, very doubtful as to whether he died of the assassination attempt. In 1865, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. 16 years later, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, and about 20 years after that, President McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo. I asked a friend of mine, an attorney, I was telling him about this book, and he said, well, Garfield, isn't he the guy that was shot in Buffalo? I said, well, no, if you go to Buffalo, the biggest high school is McKinley High School, and the biggest mall is McKinley Mall. In any event, Garfield grew up in around Mentor, Ohio. And of course, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. As to McKinley, you might be interested, the assassin was Leon Czolgosz. And about probably less than 4 weeks after he was, after the assassination, he was electrocuted. Tried and electrocuted. So there was a lot of feeling about it, as there was with Garfield. The nation was paralyzed by this act. Now, in addition to the American presidents that I mentioned, the British Prime Minister in 1812 was shot in the House of Commons. Queen Victoria was, there were 6 attempted assassinations on her. Emperor William twice, William I, and Tsar Alexander II several times. So, assassination, is that the destiny of our republic? I don't know if that's what Candace Millard was talking about, but you might think about the title of this book, and for my part, I don't think it was a very good title, but why she called it The Destiny of the Republic. It was President Garfield who, before he was shot, first of all, we didn't have any Secret Service. We didn't have any guards for presidents. They went around freely on trips and by themselves. But Garfield said, we can't guard against assassination any more than we can protect against lightning. Well, it changed after McKinley was assassinated. Then they started protecting the president and some of the main officers of the country. In any event, let me start with who was James A. Garfield. Garfield grew up in an absolutely hard-scrabble poverty. His father died when James was 2 years old. He died in a fire of a cabin out in the field where he was working. Garfield didn't have any shoes till he was 4 years old. He had a mother, a brother who was a little older, and the assets that he had to overcome this poverty. I'm going over this kind of quickly because there's a lot to cover, but he had 3 things going for him. His mother was absolutely determined that he would become well educated. His brother, who was 11, went to work on a farm to help get some money so that James could go to school. His brother was very devoted to him. And third, this guy's IQ was absolutely off the charts. He went to work as a janitor in a small school, a college in Ohio, and it was the Eclectic Institute. There were probably 25 students or so. In 2 years, he became an assistant professor of math and science and ancient languages. He worked for a time on the canal, and that was dangerous work, and he couldn't swim. One night he fell in, and it was miraculous that the line that he held on to got snagged on the boat somewhere, and he managed to pull himself back to the boat. But when he got back, sitting there in the darkness and the cold, wet, he decided that perhaps Providence had something more in store for him than working on the canal. So he went to the school, as I told you. He was a voracious reader of all kinds of things. And after 2 years at this college, the Eclectic Institute, where he was teaching, shortly thereafter, he went to Williams College in Massachusetts. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Williams College, but it's a terrific educational facility, small school, isolated. There's not much to do up there except study. And in 2 years, he graduated with honors. He went back to the Eclectic Institute, and he became the president of the college. The next thing that happened was the Civil War, and he enlisted. He was a serious abolitionist, and when he went into the Army in the Civil War, he was then a state senator. he became a lieutenant colonel in the Union Army and led a regiment of 500 men. He fought the Battle of Middle Creek, Kentucky. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Lincoln once said, I will be successful with the help of God, but I must have Kentucky. And the Battle of Middle Creek was what turned Kentucky around for Lincoln. Garfield got some books. He's out in the field, and he reads about battles and so forth. And he goes up against a force of 4,000 Confederate soldiers. And he devised a strategy that his 500 men would come from 3 different directions and convince the Confederate leader that his force, Garfield's force, was much larger than it actually was, and that was a major success for him. He comes back to the United States Senate in 1879. He said, I'm not going to seek the position. This is a leader who never wanted to campaign for anything, and he didn't campaign for the Senate, but he won. Everybody thought very highly of Garfield. And the other thing I should mention was that he was a powerful and eloquent public speaker. And in the book, I can't cover all of this, but if any of you are going to read it, Chapter 3 covers the Republican Convention in, I think, 1880, in which Garfield was there to nominate a state senator from Ohio. He got up after a long and powerful speech by one of his opponents, and he nominated the candidate from Ohio, and as he finished, he said, so who shall we bring as our nominee for the Republican office, for the office of president? And someone shouts out, Garfield. The assembly went through 36 ballots, and by the 36, little by little, delegates were switching over to Garfield. And Garfield said, he got up and raised what he said was a point of order to the whoever was leading the convention. And he said, look, I came here to nominate someone else. I'm not a candidate, and I will not permit my name to go forward as a candidate. Well, the presiding officer at the convention said, that's not a proper point of order. Sit down. And Garfield sat down. But the swell was rising, and lo and behold, at the end of it, he is stunned. He's back in a hotel. This was in Chicago, and he has a small hotel room, and he's stunned to learn that they have nominated him as president. He says, look, I'm not going to campaign. You want me? I'll do what I can, but I'm not going to campaign for this position. Well, I think he spent about $150 on his campaign. He didn't make speeches except at his home in Mentor, Ohio. He had a small home there. Incidentally, he had, I think at this time, he had a total of 6 children, 2 of whom died in early ages. And his wife, Lucretia, lived back in Ohio with the children. And a large group of German citizens, for some reason, show up at his house, as many people did, to ask him to address them. And this was the first time that an American president delivered a speech in a foreign language. He addressed them in German. He was really into languages. Okay, well, let me talk about next the book. First of all, the format. If any of you have read Devil in the White City or Thunderstruck, you know that a biographer starts out with, in this case, a centennial exhibition that brings together people whose lives later become entwined. And that was the case here. Those two books were by Eric Larson, and terrific books, but how people who have no real connection, somehow their lives later become involved. And Garfield went to Philadelphia for the Centennial Convention there, and unbeknownst to him, two other men of importance were there, at least later importance. Number one, Joseph Lister. Joseph Lister had been going around the country and lecturing about antiseptic and germs, and American doctors, they couldn't see the germs. They wouldn't change their ways. And Lister kept telling everyone that, you're killing people. You've got to use antiseptic means during surgery. American doctors generally did not accept that idea for a long time. And incidentally, it wasn't until, I think, right after McKinley's death that X-rays became available. In any event, the other one was Alexander Graham Bell. How does Alexander Graham Bell come to be involved with the president? Well, after the president was shot, as you'll hear when I describe that, they couldn't find the bullet. And the doctor who treated him starts probing around with his fingers. And in any event, Alexander Graham Bell, when he heard about the shooting of Garfield, which, as I say, absolutely paralyzed the country, and he had an idea that there was a way to create a system of a wire coil and something akin to the telephone, but if you got a piece of lead in between these coils, it would register and you might be able to locate the bullet. Incidentally, Garfield lived about 2.5 months after he was shot by Guiteau, and his treatment is what the next subject is. So, incidentally, I mentioned about the convention and the 36 ballots. Also elected at the convention was Chester Arthur, who everyone thought of as just an utter political hack. And Arthur was not Garfield's pick for vice president. Presidents didn't get to pick their vice president. Garfield ran, and he won as vice president, and it was basically a do-nothing job. But as it happened, Garfield changed after the assassination. The big political issue back then was jobs, civil service, whether we would have a civil service, the spoils system. A lot of the local politicians, they wanted the spoils system. And it wasn't until Arthur came in afterward that he put in a civil service system. No one dreamed that he would be effective in any way, but he turned out to rise to the occasion, I guess you'd say. Well, so much for, as I said, Chapter 3 about the convention. I should also tell you that for a top biographer to write a book about someone who's no longer around, typically they want an inside edge. They want personal letters that the family gives them to research. In this case, both Garfield and his wife Lucretia kept, and they'd known each other since they were in high school. But they both kept lengthy diaries. I don't know where they found the time to write them. And the writings were serious. I mean, it wasn't just, I went fishing today. It was about national issues. And Lucretia was a very intelligent woman herself. Well, beyond that, I'm going to tell you that some of the writings in their diaries and in the letters they wrote, intensely personal. I wouldn't tell you about them without reading from the book. That's how beautifully written they are. And if you read the book, you'll get to page 102 and 103, and you'll go back and read it again. I read the book twice myself, so anyway. These diaries were terribly revealing of their innermost, the depth of their feelings about each other. And then we go to Charles Guiteau. Guiteau, an unhinged lawyer. He didn't really go to law school. He was at the University of Michigan for a short time. And I think that one of the things he learned at the University of Michigan was about the defense of criminal insanity. In those days, the test was what was derived from an English case called McNaughton. And the McNaughton rule was this. If you, question number one, do you know the nature and quality of your act? Did Guiteau know when he shot him, think that he had a squirt gun? Or when someone was hit with an axe, did they think it was a feather? That's, do you know the nature and quality of the act? And are you able to appreciate that what you're doing is wrong? Now, Guiteau, this isn't in the book, but as I read it, some of the things that Guiteau read struck me as lines that came right out of the McNaughton case, and how he started to build a defense even as he was planning this. He kept saying, I'd never held a gun before. I came to it as a child would come to a gun. Well, that's the first test in the McNaughton case, and I think that Guiteau, he certainly knew what he was doing. Guiteau was a deceitful, a cunning and unpredictable individual. He thought nothing of cheating people around him, and he did that pretty much for a living. His father was a religious fanatic, lived in Oneida, and Guiteau spent some time there at this commune that his father ran. But somehow Guiteau got it in his mind that when Garfield got elected, he, Guiteau, had been responsible for the successful race that elected Garfield, and he started writing letters to people in government, including Garfield, that said that I think that I should be the ambassador to Spain. And I know you need an ambassador to Spain, so when Garfield was elected president, in those days, a president was supposed to be a man of the people. Everybody walked into the White House. There were no guards, and typically Garfield would spend the first half of every day interviewing job applicants. I mean, he didn't know anybody, and it was a terrible waste of time, and Garfield hated it. And finally, he decided to cut it back because he said, I don't have time to read, I don't have time to think. But the presidency was different at that time, so I can say. Well, let's come to the event itself. Garfield, and I'm telling you this because it's history, but believe me, I'm not telling you everything about this book or its plot. This is an in-depth look at this event. It's not that long a book, maybe 300 pages. There are some schedules afterward of her research. But Garfield goes to the railroad station in Washington, and he's with a friend, an ambassador, and I think he's going somewhere to meet his wife. He's going to get on a train and meet up with his wife. And Guiteau, who's been following him around, followed him to church and sat near him. And finally, Guiteau pulls out this gun. He fires one shot, goes through Garfield's right arm. The second shot strikes Garfield about 4 inches to the right of his spinal column, goes in about 10 inches and lodges behind the pancreas, but amazingly hit no vital organs. Now, this came as a surprise to me, and perhaps it will to you, but in the Civil War, these bullets that they were firing were lead and they were large, but a lot of people, a lot of soldiers, had bullets lodged in their bodies, and they went on to live a normal life. Some may have died from it, but typically that itself was not a mortal wound. Well, after Garfield is shot, Guiteau is seized immediately, and they call a doctor Dr. D. Edwin Bliss. And the D stood for doctor. His family named him Dr. Edwin Bliss. So he was Dr. Edwin Bliss. He seized on Garfield's injury and told everyone that he had been asked to care for the president. And he was very arrogant and very loud about it, and people believed him. I mean, there were other doctors there. Well, Bliss, he started, let me say, Garfield is laying on the floor in this completely unsanitary floor of the train station, and they bring down a horsehair blanket to put him on, or a horsehair mattress, something like that, to take him up to a room on the second floor. And Bliss comes in and says that he will be in charge of the president's. Bliss had problems with the medical society in Washington. He'd been suspended for a while. He had problems with the kinds of medication he was prescribing, but he starts probing for the bullet. He puts his finger. First of all, he takes some unsterilized probes that he had in his little bag, and he pushes those in. Then he puts his finger in, trying to locate the bullet. All the while, Garfield is in utter agony. To make a long story short, Bliss continues to treat Garfield, and I think that it is a strong case made here that the unsterilized probing for this bullet, which went on for weeks at the White House, where Bliss kept other doctors away and convinced them all that Lucretia Garfield and President Garfield had designated him as the attorney, as the doctor to treat them. Well, as I say, this bullet was in a place where it was a serious wound, but it was not a fatal wound at that point. Instead, all of this probing introduces germs and a lack of antiseptic conditions, and in effect, after 2.5 months, President Garfield essentially rotted to death from this conduct. Now, after that, Guiteau is taken to jail, and he thinks that the nation is going to rally behind him. He thought they were happier that Garfield was out of the way, and he starts writing letters to General Grant and to other people in the government, telling them that, they promised me I'd be ambassador to Spain, but I would accept the ambassadorship to Paris, to France. None of it made sense. Guiteau went to trial. Trial took 2 months, and he was convicted very quickly, a matter of hours, by a jury that couldn't wait to. And 20,000 people asked for tickets to his hanging. I think only about 1,000 people were allowed there, but he was hung within a couple of days after he was convicted. Now, with that, I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but that is the outline of, I think, an absolutely sensational book. It's not a bestseller, but the committee doesn't look for bestsellers. They look for books that they think are important, and I couldn't get over this book. If I had to tell you anything, it would be, don't listen to me anymore. Go out and get the book. That was going to be my last question to the audience. Was there a principal party in this book that you think left immortalizing something that probably all of you have said at some time or other during your lives? Ignorance is bliss. That's where it came from.